Goed. Daniel?
Yeah, because, right, because of the slides, you see, it's better, so.
I announce you. Dear colleagues, we start with the second round, and the keynote lecture is of Professor Antonio Loprieno, incoming president of ALLEA, but here as a former rector of the University of Basel, as Egyptologist, as an expert on the history of organizations and all these things. He will speak about universities, European universities, how to generate trust in knowledge production. And the two commentators are Professor Milena Tsik-Fuchs and Nikolai Vitanov, but we stay there because we have to see what and the pictures is coming. Antonio, please.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. It's a distinct pleasure to be here as a scholar today before being officially enthroned, as it were, as if ALLEA needed a throne at all, but tomorrow afternoon. And what I'd like to entertain you in the next 20-25 minutes is some observations on trust from the point of view of the double experience I've had in the recent years, and that were mentioned by Ed North. One, which is my socialization as a scholar. I am an Egyptologist, so I'm a historian of culture on the one hand. And then I had the privilege to serve as president of my university for a longish, some colleagues would think too long, period of time, which gave me a kind of double approach to the issue. So what I'd like to think about with you is the role of the two main institutions concerned with expertise, and these are the academies and the university, and how the type of trust these institutions have generated has evolved over time, and we will kind of accelerate the historical observation as closer as we come to recent days. Let's start with the beginning. The beginning in this case is the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, academy was at the same time the academy in the modern sense we give to this term, and the academy in the sense of the university. So to be faithful to my own university, I chose one of the first representations of the University of Basel, as you see, called the Academia Basiliensis, which is in fact a classroom of people listening more or less attentively to the words of a professor. Now, in this intellectual milieu, which was the intellectual milieu of Europe until the Renaissance, basically, the academy was meant to create societal elites, basically in the three main areas of expertise: church, law, medicine. And there was a very strong embedment of academy in professional life, which is something I like to remind us all of when we hear about the distance that has emerged between, or that has been claimed to emerge between academic life and real concerns in life. Now, this Academy of the Middle Ages was also a very global enterprise. Scholars were free to move. It had no national dimension at all. And it was a very, very European endeavor, because at the same time, even earlier, and at an equal level of intellectual distinction in the Islamic world, there were universities that emerged. Al-Azhar would be a typical example, that were not based on these principles that I refer to here, the embedment in a particular professional function, but rather from a religious point of view. Now, this is an important aspect to be stressed here. Trust is linked at the beginning also with an expertise in the professional areas. Things change a little bit in early modern times, and early modern times see a kind of dualism, kind of double development, in which the concept of academia and academy acquires the double meaning that it now has. We have certainly observed that when we use the adjective academic, it refers to the Latin word academia, and it basically refers to universities, whereas the noun academy does not cover the same semantic field. Now, in the 16th century, there was a development of, especially in Italy, of academies in the sense of learned societies, basically as a private enterprise. We would now say a think tank, and the image you see there is of the Academy of Fine Arts in Florence. Whereas slightly later in France, with the Académie Française, there's a new, relatively different model of academy that develops, a model of academy in which is very strongly embedded into a national enterprise, in which actually the idea of academic endeavors is to generate trust as part of a national enterprise, as part of the state's scientific and educational policy. Things changed rather drastically in the 19th century. What we now call universities or academies are this distinction that we have in mind is basically a product of the 19th century. Because in the 19th century, the endeavor called academia, that was until that time relatively similar all over Europe, was experienced in a tripartite way according to three very different regional areas, two different, we would say, cultures. The model, the prevailing model in continental Europe was, and to a certain extent still is, the so-called Humboldt model, which privileged actually the disciplinary view of academic formation. The idea is to build competent people in one particular field of expertise, which is a very different perspective from the perspective by John Henry Newman in the Anglo-Saxon world, which is the perspective of liberal arts education. The academic endeavor is basically to prepare to citizenship in society, and is followed later by a higher degree of specialization. In the French cultural area, again, there was a different development which aimed at creating the state's professional elite, especially in terms of engineering. And these three models of academic life or of higher education generate, are counterparted, are mirrored by a relative unification of our concept of academy along the German model. The 19th century is also the century in which the German model of academy as also typical expression of the higher level of university activity becomes dominant, becomes hegemonic, and is developed also on the basis of its Enlightenment agenda, not only in Germany, but also throughout Europe and even in the United States. So the idea of an academy divided into classes, usually separating disciplines in broader terms, humanities versus natural sciences, sometimes arts and medicine, is a result of this type of development. Here, in this model, trust is generated by the fact of providing and cultivating a certain level of university level research, which is mirrored by an elite position of society. We could say that until, so in this particular development in the 19th century, both at the side of the university and at the side of academies, we have an idea or a conception of trust that derives basically from status. That is, by the very fact of being member of the academia / academy, you deserve trust. And you expect trust, but you also steward trust. There's an automatic development which considers the quality of being academic, because of its eminent status within society, as a basis for the creation of trustworthiness. This is the encyclopedia, this is the horizon, the intellectual horizon, that remained pretty much unchallenged in our understanding of trust in science pretty much until the end of the last century. A conception in which trust in science and scholarship is firmly controlled by the academic communities in both senses, both in the sense of academy and in the sense of academia. The appropriateness, reliability of intellectual or epistemic models was at that time basically an internal enterprise of the academic milieus, was not so largely discussed within society. Things changed dramatically also in terms of generation of trust, sometime at the end of the 20th century. And this change has to do with a radically different model of university that developed in the last 20 years. And that is surprisingly similar, that has to a certain extent neutralized the original oppositions, to a certain extent, the original positions that existed between the three models that we saw before. And this is a development that is basically mirrored by three main changes in university life. First of all, a change in governance. The universities, public universities, used to be embedded in their respective state, and they acquire what is called autonomy. Autonomy has become a buzzword in university life in the last 20 years. But of course, we all know, those of us who deal with university know, that this is a kind of bizarre type of autonomy, because it's an autonomy under basic financial control by the carrier of the public university, which in very many cases is the state. This has forced universities to develop strategies and replacing the traditional mission statements they had by more, let's say, competitively oriented strategies, precisely because they develop a common governance as institutions. The second development, since we are talking about institutions, is precisely the organizational level. The universities, we, especially in the Central European and Southern European world, we were all accustomed to, were basically virtual entities divided in their institutes or faculties or departments, but with no cohesion at the level of the institutional entity. So there was no rallying behind the logo at the University of Basel or at the University of Zurich 20 or 30 years ago. The autonomy of the university also creates a form of stress on the role of the institution per se. tightening the administrative screws of the institution, making it more compact. And the third level is what is usually complained about, is a certain development of administration, which is due to also the autonomy of these universities. It started basically in Great Britain in the 80s, but then soon developed in also on the continent, with universities trying to also be guided by aspects of efficiency and not only of effectivity or effectiveness in their academic endeavors. Now, so just in a nutshell, these are two pictures from the University of Basel. One is you find on the left side a statue in which an artist for Basel, sculptor for Basel, summarized the University of Basel the way he saw it 1936. And the university was for him the junction of a professor and of a student, as opposed to a strategically oriented university, which is what we have now. Not common values, but more and more institutional goals. Now, that also has these changes brought about by academic, by the development of academic life in the sense of universities between the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, also changed, were the first dramatic change or challenge to the idea of trust, to the monopoly of trust. Monopoly of trust based or founded on status that we saw before, because of the creation of an academic market, because of a certain element of competition, whether we like it or not, of competitiveness that entered the academic world. More and more, the ownership of the project trust was changed from the individual single scientist owner of the trust because of his status to the institution that actually carried him or her, and thus also that was able to generate more trust than another institution at the scientific level, because the two institutions were in competition, which was not the case before the development, this kind of what I call the societal turn. There's a German word to describe it, which is a word by Max Weber, which is Vergesellschaftung, difficult to translate in English, but probably societal turn would be a good way, in which actually the university is appropriated by society at large, and the university becomes one of the stakeholders of society. Now, since we are among academicians here, academicians in the sense of academies, most of us are also embedded in a university. So if we meditate on this double identity that we wage, we have to recognize that universities were better than academies at dealing with these societal changes. Academies have remained, if we look at the role or at the financial support of academies as opposed to universities, you take the situation now and you compare the same institution regardless of the country with the situation 30 years ago, you will find that universities have increased their budget dramatically, even in relatively poor countries, dramatically, whereas academies mostly have not. So there's a cleavage between universities and academies that is created here. And this cleavage is particularly evident in the fact that universities have acquired one of the controls over trust, which was traditionally typical of academies, which was the dialogue between science and society. Universities now are much more in control, in stewardship of this dialogue than they were before, precisely because of the institutional turn that I described before. But they have also as it were, widened their portfolio. They have widened their perspective because depending on whether a university decides or has the potential to stress rather the application of science in society, or rather pure science per se, or rather innovation as a combination of both, you have a variety of options at the institutional level, which makes universities extremely attractive partners of society. Universities as institutions, even more than the single scientist per se, to be the object of trust. And this is what I call a change from eminence-based trust, which is the trust based on status before, and evidence-based trust. Now, the latest development I would like to touch on, all these dates are all arbitrary. I chose 2016 because that happens to be the year when a gentleman who is also frequently mentioned in connection with fake news was appointed to a very important political position in one of the few non-European countries. So, but I could have chosen 2015 or 14 or 17, it doesn't really matter. So it basically refers to the culture we are experiencing now. A new form of approach to trust is developing, which is based on big data, which is the result of the digital turn. And the result of the digital turn, which to a certain extent also dialectically interconnects with the rise of populism at the political level, is that that trustworthiness is quantitatively measurable. After all the likes and the clicks have a potential, a quantifying potential that also gets into our minds. So this is the equation or the evolution that I try to describe here, from popular to trustworthy, tries to capture this type of evolution. While the two preceding forms of trust are still alive and halfway well. That is the trust based on status, which is the historically common trust in our society, in our academia, and the trust based on institutional quality or distinction, so that generally, as we heard from Susan before, the statement by a professor is more trustworthy, recognized as being more trustworthy than the statement by a politician. And a paper by a scholar from Yale has a higher level of trustworthiness than a paper by a junior college because of this institutional connotation. While these two aspects are still there, there's now a new momentum, a new dimension that develops in which trust is generated by number, by algorithms, basically. Now, we could call this evolution also a form of democratization of trust. I put it in quotation marks because this is certainly a somewhat idiosyncratic way of describing democratization, as opposed to the more enlightenment idea we entertain about what democracy is in general. So this type of quantitative approach to trust or trustworthiness is certainly an enormous challenge for our mostly common understanding of what trust is, which is basically the result of these evolutions I described before, and generally speaking, of the Enlightenment project. Now, this generates also at the level of academic life and of academic activity per se, at least three challenges that we all sense, those of us who are active also in university life, in the educational dimension, we all perceive these three challenges to trust. The first is a change in our understanding of knowledge. Knowledge used to be, for most of us, something that a professor on a chair gave down to students sitting on their chairs. That's the model idea of how knowledge is transmitted since the creation of the book. And then at home, the student more or less reliably looks at the book in order to freshen things up. This type of approach to individual knowledge is being currently replaced by a different type of knowledge, which is social knowledge. That is a form of knowledge that is correctable and that is expandable also by the community and within the community. So that I can tell you very openly that many articles of Wikipedia are by far better than many articles by top Egyptologists. Certainly, because in an article by Wikipedia you have the possibility to correct things which you don't have in the case of an individual authorship. And that can be expanded to MOOCs and to all other digital devices. The second challenge has been variously described already this morning, and this is, let's call it the fake news challenge or the post-factual challenge. That is, it's the challenge created by the fact that in the very moment in the history of humankind where we have the highest level of research precision, and also, as we heard from Ollie before, also of trust in punctual research, we have the highest level of distrust in another form of, let's say, in publicly debatable or publicly negotiable trust. And this type of dichotomy is something, the dichotomy between the ever more specialized research and ever less social openness, which we traditionally, in our Enlightenment ideas, automatically connect. This kind of divorce is something that we need, so that I personally feel as a challenge even in professorial life. And the third challenge, and this will be my last comment, the third challenge is that in fact what we tend to, or what we probably should pay attention to in dealing with trust is perhaps surpassing the idea that all we need to do is to convey specialized knowledge. Because to a certain extent, specialized knowledge is easily attainable by a digitally native student with 3 mouse clicks. So every one of us comes to knowledge which is Nobel Prize close. 3 mouse clicks you get to. So in view of this very broad availability of very specialized knowledge, what I think is that the basic issue is to provide frames of reference, to provide encyclopedias, to provide interpretative mechanisms, interpretive frames, how to organize knowledge. This is what I, as a historian of culture, I find fascinating. Sad, of course, as a human being, but fascinating as an historian of culture, is that the focus on research that has been so much on the agenda of our academic institutions in recent years may turn out to be a mixed blessing from the point of view of academic education, because it generates precisely this divorce between specialized knowledge and general horizons of understanding, which I referred to before. So, if I have a message that it's a message to myself, of course. Yeah, it has by no means prescriptive wishes at all. But my point is that probably the closest approximation we can come to in terms of trust is not trust in punctual knowledge, but trust in contextual knowledge. So trust is generated by the possibility to create links between fragments of knowledge, rather than by the fact of conveying these fragments per se. Yeah? That's why I think that academies, as much as universities, it's a common endeavor of all institutions of science and scholarship, might perhaps concentrate a little bit more on this issue, on the issue of how to contextualize this ever-increasing type of research, especially in times of social knowledge. So the challenge is not so much to convey knowledge that is in general broadly accessible online, but rather to provide interpretative frames in order to be able to judge what is plausible or implausible information or knowledge, rather than acquire punctual knowledge per se. Thank you very much for your attention.
So the first discussant is Professor Vilanov, Professor of Mathematics at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. Please.
So thank you very much. Of course, several days ago, I made some research on Professor Loprieno, and my conclusion was that he is historian and I am mathematician, and it will be not very good to comment his talk, which is devoted to the history and to some modern trends. So then I decided to follow an old Japanese tactics. You know, when is the battle, then the main daimyo attacks, and then comes the move of another one, which is called karo, and karo has to make a flank attack supporting the main daimyo. And at the end is a third one, is a very important person. He, in our case, she has to kill everyone who's left after the attack of main daimyo and of the karo. And now this is the move of the karo supporting the main daimyo. So my talk will be a technical one. I have here one secret sheet. I will not show in detail to you because I made very notices from the speech of Professor Loprieno. And now let me start. I will finish in 10 minutes, no problems. Now, we are scientists from universities, from institutes of academies. We produce some information. Our information is knowledge, but there are different people, and they produce another kind of information called fake news. And all of us, the people who produce knowledge and the people who produce fake news, we have to, to sell our product to the society, and the society has several coordinating mechanisms. One of them is the market, is the price. I will not discuss here the relations between universities, academies, and market. Second coordinating mechanism is the hierarchy. I will not discuss the hierarchies, universities and academies. Professor Loprieno told that at this moment the universities are much better integrated in the society hierarchies in comparison to the academies. If we want to survive, this has to change. And the third coordinating mechanism of the communities is the trust. And this is why I will speak about. But what is trust? And why is the trust connected to numbers? There are two definitions of the trust. As mathematician, I would like to use for my work the following definition. Trust is a subjective probability. In our mathematical world, this is called Bayesian approach. Subjective probability with which an actor accesses another actor, a group of actors will perform a particular action, both before she or he can monitor such action, or his or her capacity ever to be able to monitor it, and in context in which it affects his or her own actions. This is the definition of trust I am using in my work. Here I will use another definition. This is trust is confidence in another's goodwill. Trust can be generated, so it has sources and mechanisms, and the trust has targets. So I told you it will be a little bit technical talks. I will tell you now several technical things, and then I will give you several comments. Sources of trust are familiarity, throughout repeated interaction. This can lead to trust. Second, interest can lead to trust. So you calculate your interest, and there's in mathematics even utility function, and then this can lead to trust. And then values and norms, they can lead to trust. This is the sources. The mechanisms by which trust is generated are direct interpersonal contacts, reputation networks, and our understanding the way institutes shape the other actor values and behavior. So this is the shaping of other actors' values and behavior. So this is a little bit education. I will comment on this in 2 minutes. And then we have several targets of the trust. So object of the trust can be a person, some system, or some collectivity. And finally, there are some features of the objects in which we feel trust, and this is so-called contractual trust. This means the other party is consistent, other party is competent, other party is loyal. This is the goodwill trust. Other party is honest, other party is open. So this can generate trust to us. Now, my comments from the point of view of this point of the speech of Professor Luprianu, that academies are not in position to compete effectively at the present with the universities. What we can do? Let us go again through the technical things about trust. How we can generate trust. The sources are familiarity throughout repeated interaction. So the people for Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, they know that I permanently in this hall told them you have to go to speak to the government persons, etc., etc., etc. So integrate yourself in the government and other society, community, let us say, commissions and bodies. Interest. We have to know our interest. What are the interests of academies, especially of Bulgarian Academy of Sciences? Do we know our interest? Sometimes we do know our interest. I will tell you there are more than 15 attempts. Okay, I will not talk. There are more than 15 attempts to remove me from one important commission, and half of them are from Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. Okay, if you remove me from that commission, it will not in the interest of the academy. One example. Our understanding of institution, the third source is values and norms. We can change values and norms. So the members of academies, let's say the members of universities, if you are speaking from the entire academic community, we can change values and norms in the society. We are powerful. But at least here in Bulgaria, this is not done, or is done not effectively. So the mechanisms of direct interpersonal contacts go to the government bodies, government commissions. Reputation network, build reputation networks. Do not stay in your, how to say, laboratories only. Take the example of Newton. When he started to build reputation networks, he became member of the House of Lords. increase the trust in the persons from the academic community. So we have to work in such a way that the trust in us increases. The people have to have confidence in other goodwill to produce true knowledge and not fake news, etc., etc. We have to be consistent, competent, honestly, and open. And this, I will want to stop this about the theory because I'm dealing with people who are not so, let us say, large theories, they are in practice. Today I will give for our Bulgarian colleagues one advice, and in order to give this advice I thought that I have a special dress here, you see, so I will take the theoretical suite in order to give the practical advice. You see, you see, let's see, the tigers. So we have to be active like tigers, but there are different level of activity. This is tiger in Japanese is Tora. Tora is active. Tora is more active. What is Tora? This is the command to attack Pearl Harbor, even more active. And you see, the tigers are more than 3. So be active. This is my practical advice. The time's up. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I've got so many papers that. Is it on? Yeah. I'm sorry for sitting down, but this talk was so fascinating that I have all these papers and it's impossible to fiddle with them up there. I'm going to touch upon certain aspects of your talk and pick up on a couple of ideas. And as you've heard, the two of us are discussants for the incoming president as of tomorrow, so it's not a very, I would say, comfortable position to be in, but okay. Now, what I really appreciated was your overview of the development of universities and academies, etc., because they indicate the possibility of change, right? And I think that is an important point to pick up, because at the very end of your talk, and when I have to get the right paper, you won't mind, is that your point was that specialized knowledge and the loss of frames of reference had to be somehow compensated in order to build up trust again, if I understood correctly. Right, but my question will be, which frames of reference were you referring to? When you talk about contextualization, what does this mean? These are big words, you know, frames of reference and conceptualization. So a bit more elaboration on this, I really would appreciate it. Now, despite the fact that you're the incoming president, not everybody is enamored with big data. In fact, I'm a linguist by profession. Not everybody is enamored with the Wikipedia. One thing I tell my students is, to, you know, be very careful. If you look at Wikipedia, go back to the original of whatever, you know, what you're looking at and have a good look. Now, Chomsky is still alive and kicking, but if he sees what is written about his various theoretical aspects, he would be turning around alive, not in his grave yet, but the day will come, no doubt. I have serious doubts about that, and doubts about big data as being, you know, referential knowledge, or whatever you call it, should be, to my mind, taken with a big grain of salt. As a linguist, and I talked about this yesterday in our workshop, I discussed corpora, which are one of the tools that linguists use. But a corpus is nothing else but the reflection of the texts that are in it. In other words, you're dealing with a very restricted, limited, even the big ones. I'm talking about the pan-European infrastructures that have millions and millions of, tokens and items, etc. So, this part, I think, should be at least relativized and not taken as the gospel, as they say, because big data does have its pluses. But I think it should be dealt with great caution and great care. I will not go into the examples where big data has already produced misleading results, which have not enhanced trust. This is, I think, a major point. But at my final words, I do have a few minutes there, don't I? Okay, is that when you talked about these new frames of reference, and this is something that I talked about yesterday in the workshop, but it was picked up by my colleagues who participated, and I'll just sort of list them. Moral values that were mentioned in Susan's presentation, something very, very important. Trust and trustworthiness, but I would say, very much tied in with respect. And since we now know what your specialty is, it is especially the respect between the so-called hard sciences and the social sciences and humanities. And last but not least, communication. And I will not go into that because the third session is on that. And communication is essential for these frames of knowledge, if I'm getting them right, and I'm sort of waiting for your explication on that. It is also very, I would say, important in this digital age. Because all this talk about fake news, it's not just interesting incidents that happen. They're reality. We do have little ecosystems, but then I won't go into Jose's paper, which are extremely influential. And, they sort of undermine, not always, but they can undermine trust in universities, academies, call it whatever you like. Okay, that would be for me.
Thank you. Short reaction?
Very short reaction, and again, so, having colleagues think about one's own contribution actually makes oneself revise or rethink particular dimensions. So, to what Nikolai said, I must say, so if your call was that we should all become, we should all acquire a form of tigerness in order to to present ourselves, I'm absolutely with you. I mean, academies as tigers, it requires a little bit of a leap of faith, but I'm sure that we can certainly work in that direction. And what I also particularly liked was this idea, this redescription of trust as subjective probability, which is what I tried in a very informal and certainly not mathematically reliable way as plausible versus not plausible information. And here I come to Milena's very, very insightful comments. I will concede you one thing, which is absolutely, which is perhaps the underlying answer to the entire attitude that I have with vis-à-vis what I described. Yes, I think that to a certain extent, precisely because we have gone through the experience of post-structuralism, and precisely because we know that actually we don't really know what just empirical truth is, but there is always a hermeneutic paradigm within which you can or you have to. Precisely because of that, I have become a little bit freer. I feel myself freer to admit what my own paradigm is. Okay, so to say, well, so the frames of reference always implies a form of a certain set of values, a certain reading of the world, yeah, which is not neutral per se. Yes, I think you're right. I think you're right. And this is what I try to describe in this strange formula Enlightenment 2.0. Enlightenment 2.0, I mean ultimately deriving one's frames of reference from the experience or from the moral values or the values of the critical thinking of the Enlightenment, knowing that at the very absolute level this is just one of the possible frames of reference and not the frame of reference, but doing as if that was the frame of reference. And the point that you made about big data, of course, I mean, and I'd like to perhaps to you give me the possibility to make one thing clear. What I said is not what I think should be, and certainly not what I necessarily subscribe to from a moral or ethical point of view. I said simply what I see. Yeah? And the relevance of big data is not something that I particularly cherish or that I'm particularly in love with, for the very same reason that you stressed. But I, as a cultural historian, as it were, I observe it the way I try to observe the language of the ancient Egyptians, right? With as much enlightened neutrality as possible, knowing that it's not neutral. Not neutral at all. So it's this form of double attitude. There is a certain trend towards privileging the quantitative dimension, and that's something that I think we should, so whether we like it or not, we should consider when we speak about issues of trust. Okay. Thank you.
So, now there are a possibility for questions, and Carlo was the first. Please take the mic.
Just a question to Antonio. I focus on contextualization. That seems to be a concept that plays an important role in your talk. My question is the following. Have we to conceive contextualization as, say, a sort of intuition, something that involves an artistic attitude of the mind, or something that I'm approximate, but might be treated in principle through artificial intelligence, for instance?
Okay.
This is very interesting, Carlos. It's a very central issue. I would let me tell you what I observe on this issue of the intuition. I observe a certain rediscovery of the emotional dimension. You know, science takes simulation. Simulation, as a result of digitization, is enormously emotionally loaded, yeah, because it creates a reality that to a certain extent is a fictive reality, is a simulation of reality, and so challenges us also at the emotional level. So there is the rediscovery, as it were, of the emotional level, which in the classical Enlightenment one approach, in the classical approach to science that we all grow up with, had been removed and banished to the side. And so even if you use the term intuition, there's certainly right now a greater predisposition towards including this type of perhaps not really rational dimension including in the scientific analysis. That's my reading. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, please.
Olivier Pironneau from the Academy of Science, France. Hi, Antonio. Some 10 years ago, there was some debate with the historians, shocking debates, that they were saying that it didn't actually the things in the past, whether it occurred or not, wasn't important. And do you think we could learn something from this debate?
You know, this is, Olivier, this is really these are really two fantastic questions, because this is another issue that has to do with a particular philosophical evolution that we all experience. And I'll try to make it to present it in as concise a way as possible. It so happens that digitalization, that the digital turn took place in the history of our society and of our civilization at the very same time in which, at the level of intellectual development, methodological approaches, there was a triumph precisely of this post-structural dimension that I referred to before. We could say, simply put, of a relativistic approach. That is, precisely in the very moment of our history, end of the 20th century, in which we tended as a society to lose faith in the value of empirical results as absolute rules to abide with, precisely in that moment there is the development of what we call now the digital turn. That has created this type of bizarre consequences that you describe in this moment. That one can say, well, the past actually doesn't really exist, which is a strange way to put it. Certainly, I can tell you as an Egyptologist, I think that if Ramses II came into this room and I tried to reconstruct the pronunciation of the ancient Egyptian language, this is my job. If Ramses II came into this room and I tried to use my rules in discussing with him, he would say, but what is this guy talking about? He would not understand a single word. So my reconstruction of ancient Egyptian, which is the best possible way that I can empirically, certainly is very far from truth or from reality the way the past was. But it's the best guess we have. All right? So it's halfway between the maximum we can reach, and that can be improved in 20, 30, 200 years, even more. So certainly the past did not exist in the way you read in the books of history. However, it's very dangerous to say, the books of history, that's just nonsense, because it's not nonsense. It's the closest approximation we have to reconstructing the past according to the scientific paradigms we have in mind now. But of course, this is not the true past. It's a simulation of the past, right? And so it's always being in between. And that is precisely the problem with trust. You see, when someone asks you, are you 100% sure? The probability, the individual, the subjective probability. Are you 100% sure of what you say as an expert? No. No one. There's no mathematical, absolutely safe statement that you can make as an expert. But you must have this type of frame of reference, this type of education to probability that comes with your scientific life in order to say, well, but there's a very high likelihood that this piece of information is correct. There's no absolute. And when you have this discussion with social scientists, that basically the issues that revolve around this problem.
Okay, thank you. More questions, remarks, statements? Günther.
I agree totally with you when you said we need to enable judgment of the people. Now, how to do that? Because what we do see is a lack of understanding and willingness to understand complexity of the issues. And if I see the sheer amount of new data coming up and the trivialization of knowledge in the internet, also within Wikipedia, people tend to believe that's easygoing issue. Now, how much facts do we need to convey in order to give an understanding of the complexity behind and get out of this easygoing and nevertheless make them or bring them in a situation for judgment?
If I had the answer to this question, of course, this is a question for us. This is the question that is being debated in scholarly meetings such as ours. But What I find fascinating in your question, or also in your way of formulating it, is that you use the term complexity. Because that is precisely what, in my opinion, generates this kind of distrust that we are talking about. It is extremely difficult in a society that is governed by social media and that requires a limited attentional, or expect a limited attentional concentration or level of focus. It's extremely difficult to present complexity in such a way that it can lead to this educated judgment, to this subjective probability that has a level of likelihood. So it's as if through the digital age we had lost the sense of the analog for the analog mode. It's as if through the primacy of the digital mode, we can only think in digital terms, yes or no. And in most issues, there's no yes or no. There's a very broad hierarchy of analog possibilities. And the core issue of trust right now is that trust tends to be treated, what I said quantitatively, tends to be treated digitally, whereas it can only be treated analogically. Yeah. And that is the entire problem.
There's still time for one question. Please. Oh.
Ole Petersen, Vice President of Academia Europaea. I very much recognize the picture you give of the relative evaluation of academies and universities over the years. However, I just want to make the comment there are huge differences in different European countries. And we can maybe also learn something from that. I have sort of come to the age in my life where I'm a member and fellow of many different European academies. And at one extreme, I'm sorry to say that in my native country, Denmark, the Royal Danish Academy of Sciences is not very influential, and it's probably very typical of the kind of development that you had said. And if you ask a lot of Danish practicing scientists about the importance of the academy, they say, well, it plays no role whatsoever. In contrast, the Royal Society in the UK continues to be extremely influential. And why is that? The reason is that it has an election process that is agreed by everybody as being very, very competitive, but also very fair, with a constant turnover of selection committees. It has always elected presidents who immediately are recognizable as very eminent people. And for that reason, it has acquired also resources that enable it to do a range of things. And although you are certainly right that even in the UK, of course, the financial resources of universities have also increased vastly more than that for all society, the influence in the public domain and also the soft power is still very, very considerable. So I think that example shows that there is a place for academies, and if they play their hand well, they can continue to have a very, and I think, beneficial influence on public life.
Okay. Last comment?
Say thank you very much, Ole. That's a very important piece of information, as incoming president who will not behave in a dictatorship way. You know, I can assure you, Milena, that nothing more remote from dictatorship than ALLEA, from what I've seen. So, but I can only take this as an expectation also on my role, that I involve myself and I do my best in order to reach this ideal state. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. I want to thank the speakers, commentators. We have again 20 minutes before we start on the last round. And I was told that you can't have coffee, you can have coffee, not only here next door, but in the garden too. So there must be an admittance to the garden. But in 20 minutes, you should be back.
the sound. Can I? Oh. Are you sure? Because it's going to fall off. Yeah? Okay.
Is it stable?
Yeah, pretty much. Now, I need to move this over to here. Oh, perhaps like this. I don't need sound.
Also Sie gehören zu den Auserwählten.
Merci.
Great. Yeah, I do.
When you finish.
I will finish and I will set it up. You know, everyone uses text only, and I only use pictures. I always do talks by using pictures. And I usually don't even write it, but because of my voice, I've written some sentences down. So. But I usually just talk with pictures. Yeah. So, okay.
Hi Erik. Ja, dat is ook goed. Jullie zijn hier gekomen, hè? Ja, ze zijn hier. Oké. Oh ja. Nou, José is zometeen... Ja, nou ja, gisteren in de workshop. Een hele zieke vogel. Maar het is iets. Oh. Ja.
Neben dir, muss lachen.
Nee. Ja.
Ein bisschen Schweizerdeutsch. Also fantastisch, wir können auch richtige Deutsch reden. Ja, ganz genau. Das für Sie. Alles Gute, merci vielmals. Gut.
Ja, dus... mensen nee, dat is zo. Ja, een beetje. En die hadden van alleen naar verschuiving. Verschuift nog ongeveer. Dan zou je Zweden kunnen. Nou ja, goed. Dus we moeten er nog even over. Maar er zitten. Ja.
Het scheelt al heel wat.
Ja, natuurlijk. En dit wordt zo meteen prachtig. Suzy, heel veel. Heel dik. En dit is modern. Dit is inderdaad ja.
Criteria zijn. Polarization en voorstellen zijn geselecteerd en allemaal. Gaan jullie iets over die criteria zeggen?
We hebben daar iets over gedaan, maar het gaat er niet om wat we doen. Alle voorstellen komen over de bestaan. Maar het gaat om een beetje de
Wij dachten over dat nano-voorstel. Hoe wordt dat nou echt? Misschien staat het niet heel erg.
Nee, wij proberen altijd het geheel hebben.
Ja, maar in de praktijk.
Moeilijk.
Ja, en we hebben natuurlijk een andere.
Ja. Dus, nee, maar dat kan gewoon gediscussieerd worden. Kijk, maar het is dat is dat begin van Sofia een soort top-down zaak. Er komen nu
mooi. Ik hoop dus ook dat die helft in de conferenties met wij
ja.
eindelijk ook de armen
Ja. Ja, dat zou
ik heel blij dat 4 leden samen trekken.
Ja, ik weet het, vorige week.
Ja.
Dus in de nieuwe liefde. Ja. Wanneer is die verbouwing eigenlijk?
Ja, dat is natuurlijk.
Erk van der Linden, hè?
We bump into each other.
Ja.
Maar ja, elke keer kan ik bij een flex wat zo'n bedoel was.
Ja. Nou ja, oké, maar...
Ik even een diepbouw en zo.
Ja, maar dit loopt goed. We hadden de workshops is er voor.
Ja.
Ja, maar ik zat in Amsterdam dus niet. Ja, dat geef ik. Maar simpel, ik had gedacht, dit is afgelopen van een vrije hand. Dus ik ga 4 maanden in de kunst. En dan voel ik wat ik kan. Nee, die hebben we nu uitgeschreven voor een project.
Ja, heerlijk.
Waar ik echt op zit. Je krijgt een mooi huis. Dus, maar
Natuurlijk sowieso een ervaring.
ja, ben ik. Dus dat is. En er is nog leuk.
Ja,
Nou ja, ja. Maar, nou ja, morgenmiddag. Financiële dingen. Ja, nee. Ja. Nou ja. Nu hebben we dus dat we zeggen, een reserve van 1/3 ongeveer van het jaar. Nou, dat is nou, kun je vertegenwoordigen. We willen het niet te hoog maken. We willen mensen op de baan betalen.
Ja, zoals jullie. Ja, als je het toch niet uitgeeft, dan krijg je dan.
Maar goed, dit
Je hebt ook wel eens gewerkt. Je zou minstens 1 jaar eigen kant moeten hebben.
ja, dat is natuurlijk het idee. En dat duurt niet. Maar kijk, we hebben ook gezegd het contract en dat weet ik. Ik heb een goed gevoel om het zo achter te maken. En zeggen van dat is dus kijken met zo'n in Berlijn daar met z'n vijven een heel internationaal team. Dat gaat ook iets lekker. Ja, dat is echt heel leuk. Dat zal ik ook even zeggen. Ik zal dus punten toespreken tijdens wisseling. Nou ja, dat ga ik even kijken, we hebben morgenochtend dat Sofia eerst. Dan morgenmiddag de General Assembly. Dus een paar moeilijke punten, maar gewoon zoals we het elk jaar doen. En dan de verkiezingen.
Ja.
En dan sluiten we af met het idee met de oude en nieuwe boord. En president, ik weet niet precies wie allemaal uitgenodigd is. Zit hij erbij?
Als hij niet verkozen is, zit hij er niet.
Ja. Dus, sorry dat ik niet meer kan doen, want dat niet kan. Maar, maar het is een beetje, natuurlijk, je moet natuurlijk niet over je graf heen, maar,
Zo is het altijd in de vereniging.
ja, waar je kunt aankloppen en waar je kunt zeggen, jongens, we hebben dat en dat nodig, willen jullie meedoen? Ja, nee. Nou ja, kan er nergens bij invallen. Soms min en soms meer, maar...
Ja, ik weet er vanaf hoe je
Ja,
dus.
ja. Of een leven dan. Hoe heet ze? China. Ja. Wij zijn in Crystal Palace.
Oké. Ja.
Okay.
Alles heet hier boutique.
Ja. Dan krijg je aanwending. Maar nee, de workshop was goed. Natuurlijk. Enig ja, die is dan moet er nog weer komen. We hadden veel aanmeldingen. Please be seated. We start again. Ook Inge. We start for the last and third round. Door is closed yet. Okay, thank you. And you see already what we are doing. José van Dijk will deliver the speech and the lecture. So I invite her, and we have two commentators. It will be Vasil Kirov and Christiane Wopen. But I suppose it's the best to stay here in order to see your
Thank you, Ed, and thank you for having me to deliver a speech. Well, I will do. Can you hear me okay in the back? I have a terrible cold, so I apologize in advance for delivering this speech with a terrible voice. Right. This made it even better, right? Yeah, I can hear it myself now. Because I have a cold, my ears are as well sort of, disturbed. So please interrupt me if you can't hear me, you will just wave. And thank you for delivering a speech today. I will try to combine some of my responses to what we have heard before today. But let me start my talk with an example. Last year, a friend of mine who has a 16-year-old daughter, her daughter came home announcing that she wanted to become a vegan because she said, and I quote, "Eating meat causes as much cancer as smoking cigarettes." And when my friend asked her daughter for the source of her sudden persuasion, she referred to the World Health Organization, which would have been quoted in What the Health, which is the documentary you see on this little screen here, and that is a Netflix documentary mailed to her via her Facebook account by her girlfriends. And all of these friends, she added, all of these friends are going to be vegan. So my friend and her daughter, they both sat down to watch What the Health to check a few so-called facts in this documentary. And although this documentary indeed referred to some of the WHO reports, it was soon clear that it also contains a variety of half-truths and distortions and manipulations and just outright nonsense. So I think this mother-daughter scene, I don't know how many of you have children in a teenage, do you have teenage children? How many of you? Not that many, but those of you who do, they will certainly recognize this scene. And it actually this one scene touches upon a very important issue. How can a 16-year-old learn to distinguish reliable sources in an online media landscape that inundates her with information and opinions? That is a really basic question. Now, over the past few years, we have encountered the problem of fake news and disinformation on the internet. But scientific disinformation is a special category, a special case that I think deserves due attention. There are countless examples ranging from the very subtle to the very blatant that, I have no time to go into today. But here, for instance, I'm going to show you a few examples that make me laugh the most. But take this example, for instance. It's about the vaccine denial debate, where deniers claim there have been 0 US measles deaths in 10 years, but over 100 measles vaccine deaths reported. Or take this one, and I like this particular, although it's in Dutch. I will translate it for you. This is a nice example of scientific misinformation. It's a report claiming that vaccines stimulate homosexual feelings in children. And you may not be familiar with you may be familiar with the climate change movement, climate change deniers, but you may be less familiar with the flat earthers. And those are advocates who claim to have evidence that our planet more or less looks like a pancake. So just in case you didn't know, this kind of, this kind of information, this is what children encounter on the internet. Now, my main concern here this afternoon is how can trust in expertise be anchored in a digital society? For many citizens, for students, for youngsters, it has become increasingly harder to assess information and separate scientifically developed knowledge from humbug. And over the last year, much has been said about this multi-layered problem of fake news, but less has been said about a specific case of scientific disinformation, which I think really rewards our attention. What's at stake here is not just eroding trust in scientists who produce knowledge, or in journalists and citizens who disseminate that knowledge through media. The stakes are actually much higher than that, for the problem I discuss here this afternoon pertains to the complex ways in which trust is secured and anchored in our digital society. Over the past decades, the specific issue of trust in science has received due attention. And as the president of the Dutch Royal Academy over the past 3 years, I've been involved in many reports on this specific issue. This is a report that was published in 2013, and that was an advisory report titled literally Trust in Science, which argues that trust is based on 4 pillars, and you see them here. Of course, integrity, transparency, independence, and accountability. Of course, scientists or scholars, they're no individual arbiters of truth. We trust their judgment because that judgment is embedded in institutional processes and anchored by checks and balances that we have made transparent and to which academics can be held accountable. Research and discussion have often led in our academic world to consensus. The planet Earth is more or less round. The ice caps on the North Pole decreased rapidly in the past decade, and smoking tobacco raises chances of contracting lung cancer. Now, many of our policy decisions are grounding in trusting scientific expertise. When after decades of scientific debate, there's a 97% consensus among climate experts on human-induced causes of melting ice caps on the North Pole, of course, this justifies a comprehensive climate agreement. And we're now, pretty much agreeing in our societies on the danger of smoking by implementing policies for non-smoking in public areas. Of course, there are many other kinds of subjects on which there is no consensus yet, or simply no consensus, or where research results are preliminary or at best tentative. So this creates, of course, a sense of uncertainty. But of course, you all know, without room for exploration, without discussion, without experiment, there would be no new knowledge. So striving for what we call common ground is a profound value in democratic societies. And establishing trust and expertise is a pillar of such societies. Now, we've been discussing this book on and off again, over the past 2 days. So I will return to that. Of course, there is nothing wrong with healthy distrust vis-a-vis, some prevailing view. On the contrary, we do need critical assessments constantly. However, in recent years, the opinions of ordinary citizens seem to carry as much weight as the findings of experts. And according to this American historian, Tom Nichols, whom we have seen before in a talk before today, this rendering of all opinions and judgments interchangeable will ultimately lead to what he calls the death of expertise. Now, frankly, I think Nichols' conclusion is rather overstated, but it makes you indeed wonder why scientific expertise is struggling so much, particularly in the age of digital media, and that's what I would like to focus on from now. So, to raise that question, we actually need to ask 2 questions. What do we expect from more or less traditional media when it comes to communicating scientific results and weighing expertise versus opinions in public debates. And the other question is, what has changed since the emergence of the internet, and what has become the role, especially of social media, in this process? Now, let me start with the first and deal very briefly with that, but it is perhaps no coincidence that trust in media as a societal institution rests on the same pillars as trust in science: integrity, transparency, independence, and accountability. And just like science, traditional media tend to rely on a system of institutional checks and balances, which is pretty much organized control that is crucial for embedding trust in media in our societies. Now, for instance, by weighing a public debate's facts and opinions side by side, or by contrasting them to other facts or views, by journalists presenting outcomes based on rationally sound arguments, there are a number of these checks and balances that journalists have actually built into their institutional procedures. But over the past few years, well, actually, first 2 decades, but especially the past 2 years, the rapid rise of online and social media created a new dynamic between citizens and institutions. And by those institutions, I mean, of course, science and media. And the focus of public debate shifted from traditional media to online media, and particularly social media such as Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and thousands, don't forget the thousands and thousands of network blogs. Now, along with this media transformation, one can also perceive a political shift. Especially since 2016, we can see that the scientific discourse of logical reasoning and rational evidence, of what I would call common ground and common sense, has increasingly met with attacks from various sides. And these two developments have seriously shaken the institutional pillars of trust both in science and in media. Now, to explain this phenomenon and to elaborate on it, some refer to, actually for explanation, some refer to it to technological arguments, while others point to user behavior, which is just as important, and again others, they refer to an overall transformation of the public debate, more like a social or societal transformation. And there's many more other explanations, but I will concentrate on these 3 and briefly elaborate on them. First, the technological argument. Of course, the arrival of the internet would have changed the relationship between expert and layperson. After all, every citizen or organization can now generate, publish, and disseminate information. In fact, all content has become equal on the internet, while context is increasingly absent as a marker. Now, the digital channels for spreading knowledge often give users little basis as to who says what in which context and based on what authority or expertise. And we refer to this phenomenon as context collapse. See, for instance, this example about vaccine resistors. The message that you see on the screen carries all the outer features of a trustworthy scientific source. And yet, it is very difficult to evaluate this source's so-called truthfulness, independence, and especially accuracy due to a lack of context. A second explanation for the undermining of trust in science and media requires us to look at the behavior of human users of social media. And this is a very recent study, I think it was published in March in Science, which revealed that, this was in the context of fake news, by the way, but it revealed that social media users pay more attention to misinformation than they do to true, so-called true items. And moreover, many users let themselves be led by their prior knowledge or prejudice in assessing the value of a message. So it's a very interesting piece of research. If you're interested in it, you can look it up, and it was very broadly covered in the so-called serious news media, mainstream news media. Now, we generally refer to this type of phenomenon as confirmation bias. It's a very broad term, but it applies to this situation. Social media actually take a lot of advantage of this by giving individual users exactly the kind of information to which they are receptive. Platforms, social media platforms, generate more clicks and hence more attention, and of course make more money. Since the Cambridge Analytica scandal, we know how many detailed information, which we call data points, tech companies can collect on every individual user. But there's also a major role here for the human friend who forwards the message. As we saw in the example, my first example of the documentary What the Health, Facebook friends were central in disseminating certain information on veganism through social media. That's where my daughter's friend got all the information from her friends. And this specific process of electronic peer pressure particularly impacts teenagers and young adults much more than, people 25 years and older. Sorry to for my throat, but a third explanation for the decline of trust and expertise pertains to forces who deliberately organize distrust via blogs and social media. And I actually started to call this phenomenon polarization push. A recent example of this was just a few weeks ago in, all over the news, is climate change deniers claiming that polar bear populations do not at all decline as a result of climate change. Interesting. But their strategy was even more interesting. Their strategy was to widely and rapidly disseminate a single disputable source in an effort to discredit all climate change. So, for many scientists and scholars, such deliberate polarizing efforts, they come as a shock, understandably, because they're all nursed in a scientific culture marked by careful hypothesis and nuanced logic, argumentative reasoning. And now suddenly they find that they have to defend themselves in an online world where all opinions are considered equal, where opinions are more profitable than facts, where one-liners do better than logical argument, and where polarization prevails over common ground and common sense. In an online society, institutions of science and media are undercut constantly by a new dynamic of online disinformation that forces these institutions to reflect more fundamentally on the new meaning of trust. Now, all of us, we're currently in a transitional phase in which public institutions have to reinvent themselves in order to take root in a new and yet very soggy terrain of big data, an unknown terrain of platforms and of algorithms. But the pillars of institutional trust, which I showed you in the beginning, integrity, transparency, autonomy, and accountability, they will, perhaps paradoxically, become even more important in the future. Well, we can no longer, as scientists, as scholars, we can no longer rely on self-evident authority. We can no longer trust, trust is trust-based and legitimated by institutional status, as it was for a while ago, as we just heard from Antonio. We're no longer, you can no longer just, point at people, say, hey, dude, that is a card-carrying member of the academy, he or she should be trusted. But institutions, at the same time, universities as well as academies, as well as media, by the way, but I'll focus on the first, institutions need to adapt to the demands of the 21st century. They cannot do without. So I'll come back to the idea not of big data, but of open data and open science. How will they adapt? That is a really important question. And it's impossible for me to inscribe this in detail in just 20 minutes that I got allotted. But most importantly, I think academics, perhaps counterintuitively, but they need to become even more transparent, more open, and more public than ever before. Researchers are explicitly urged to make their work accessible, but also to clarify their methods of data processing and interpretation. Open data implies the opening up of databases and sources for fellow experts, So they are able to verify and replicate studies, as they always did, and some disciplines do really well, as we heard yesterday in our workshop. But we also need to open up these findings to interpretation, and this is, of course, not even enough. Open science efforts will require inventiveness and, Milena, critical awareness, as you just pointed out, on the part of researchers. They simply have to deal with the underlying complexities of big data, the morality of algorithms, and particularly their contextualization. And this, of course, perfectly fits in with what Milena and Antonia was just arguing. In short, researchers have no choice. Without transparency, without openness, control on scientific integrity is simply impossible. But then there's this other side, of course, that we have encountered repeatedly. Transparency and open source, open science makes scientific experts even more accountable, but also renders them more vulnerable to attacks, from anywhere. And some academics have bravely taken on the struggle by systematically refuting deceitful stories and outright fabrication. Some of my colleagues are constantly putting, across counter narratives, and constantly, in fact, doing this sort of fact-checking that, like in fake news, we need, to some extent, in fake science. But however laudable their efforts, I think it's ultimately undoable for scientists to fact-check all internet hypes. They would not be able to do their actual job anymore if they were constantly, fact-checking. And this is why scholars are working hard to develop new online tools for assessing the reliability of sources. I have many colleagues, who are actually working on just that, also helping news media and journalists. People help to check facts, but they also do that for research. And these attempts are part of a concerted effort of academics to reinvent themselves in response to our evolving digital world. In that effort, I think the support of politicians, of policymakers, and citizens is absolutely indispensable. Now, over the past 2 years, it became clear that such support for science and research can no longer be taken for granted in countries worldwide, not even within the West, not even within the United States of America. And to underscore their concern about this development, scientists and citizens took to the streets in over 600 cities worldwide to join a March for Science on April 22nd last year. This march, by the way, was not about funding. A lot of people thought it was about funding. It was not. It was actually about asking the world to support their institutional grounding in trust and expertise while the world goes through political, technological, and ecological transformation. Indeed, as scholars, as scientists, as educators, we find ourselves in the middle of a transition, and we're expected to help shape that future. And this brings me back to the story of my friend's daughter and the question it raised. How can a 16-year-old learn to distinguish legitimate sources from nonsense in a confusing media landscape? Now, one answer sounds easy, but it's very difficult and very important. And that answer is we really need to invest in education. Even though it's not a panacea, we have to invest in it on all levels. From the primary schools, I just heard this gentleman in the back asking that question. Yes, we have to go all the way from primary schools to university and beyond, and graduate schools. Students attending schools and universities will have to learn in old and new ways when expertise is trustworthy, and particularly when it's not. So how to make independent judgments and how to evaluate context that you've never learned from, a different, more paper-like publishing background. Now, this mission to bolster trust and expertise will have to be pursued at all educational levels and should be prioritized, I think, on the agendas of universities, of academies, of science councils in the years to come. Indeed, a digital society cannot function properly without open and public institutions, but this assumes that those who run the institutions actively engage in shaping the online dynamic of which they are inevitably part. So to sustain common ground and common sense as a basis of our digital society, we need to ensure that science and education continue to exist as a common good. Now, a democratic society means a society in which all people are equal, but not all expressions are equally true. It is a society in which universities offer ample room for students to express, and launch different opinions, but also to discover common ground and common interests. It is a society in which students can find data and information along with the wisdom needed to evaluate knowledge claims. After all, we will soon have to rely on trusting our children's expertise for shaping society in new ways. And that is why it is so crucial to reflect on how we can effectively organize a democratic digital society in which trust and expertise is anchored in old standards but wrapped in new mechanisms. Thank you very much for your attention. I have to. I will, but I need to show this slide.
May I ask Vasil Kirov and Vasil here to the stage?
Thank you.
Oh, well, what you prefer?
Okay, probably here it will be easier. Is this one? Okay. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, thanks very much for this invitation. It's an honor to be here and to comment briefly this excellent speech of Professor Van Dijk. I would say first that before reading her excellent presentation, her excellent paper, never heard about her, and actually this is probably something connected to the question of expertise, because very often in sciences we are in our narrow fields. On the conferences we know people well, and this is probably one of the challenge of this kind of events, that we are here from different disciplines, from different perspectives. And it will probably important to say that I'm coming from the perspective of social sciences, of sociology, and I'll try probably to bring a bit in this debate also in a way the voice of New Europe or Central and Eastern European countries. I agree a lot with what has been said in an excellent manner, because I think Professor Van Dijk was able to say in a very simple way to express very complex ideas. It is something that we need actually in order to reinforce scientific expertise in this question. But before probably going directly to the few questions I would like to comment, we are by the end of the day, I'll try to say very briefly a joke about an expert, not a scientific expert, but a kind of international expert that we have seen a lot here in the Balkans. And somewhere in the Balkan mountains, there's an old shepherd with all his sheep. There was an international guy coming with his laptop and nice vehicle and said, hello, hello. May I tell you exactly the number of sheep you have? But, yes. And if I am right, would you give me one sheep? Yeah, no problem. And after a very complicated calculations, he has a satellite, etc. You have exactly 1,374 sheep. Exactly. You are right. But the shepherd asked him, could you give me my sheep back? No, you can't take your sheep, but could you give me my sheep back if I guess what's your profession? Yeah, how this old man can recognize what's my profession. He said, okay, you're an international expert. How you guess? First, you came here without having been invited. Second, you've told me something that I already knew. And third, you don't recognize anything in the matter because you took the dog. And actually, listening to this excellent speech, we should recognize that now in this very quickly developing digital society, because okay, digitalization is not new as such, but this word now of digital disruption, okay, it's a big debate, whether it is disruption or not. This word of social media, this new way of communication has developed probably the last 8, 10, 12 years. We are witnessing a very quick development. And in this world, there is probably a reinforcement of this relationship to expertise. We know very well here in Bulgaria there are a lot of people that we say that everybody is expert on politics and on football, sometimes leading to very bad outcomes. And I think that in the digital society we became also a lot of people that are not from the scientific milieu became also expert on science. And here I think one of the first probably very interesting idea that was said, listening to the nice example of the daughter of your friend, is that finally some of the scholars tried to oppose, to resist in a way. And how they tried it to decode. And I think there is something also happening in the nowadays media, and some of the mainstream media. Take for example the newspaper Le Monde in France, because the last years some kind of rubrics like of decodage, they are trying to decode. So they are trying to oppose, yes, this kind of fake news, this kind of expertise by decoding the different narratives. And my first question will be here, because listening to you, you said, yes, but it's a lost battle of decoding. And probably there are some very powerful tools of the artificial intelligence, of some software that will be able to allow us to check if it's fake news, what are the sources, etc. I'm a bit skeptic, and probably it will be not a quick move, let's say. So my deal is that probably we need kind of better hybridization, if I might use this term in the first panel, between this human decodage and between the artificial intelligence or software or whatever. So I'd like to ask you, what do you think about? And your second big question, because behind the question of trust in expertise, trust in scientific expertise, you put in question how our institutions, our academies, our universities, our research centers could adapt to this world. And my question would be, yes, there is this big challenge, but our institutions are also in different other type of challenges. Being myself in the investigation of work and employment, witnessed there are big debates about the fragmentation of the status of researchers, of these dual labor markets in the research world, that you have the corpus of highly distinguished professor, and after that you have all the rest that are moving from one temporary contract to another temporary contract. And probably this fact also could be connected with the question of social utility, with the connection of respect, of trust, of the figure of scientists. If I'm running, as many of my colleagues in different countries, in Western or in Eastern part of Europe, from one small country to another, how people will trust me as a scientist? It's a big question also related to the democratic question. So probably I'll stop here, and of course I'll be happy to continue taking part in this discussion. Thank you very much.
Distinguished colleagues, Mr. President, I'm very honored to be here, and I'm very glad to be invited to comment on what José said. So thank you very much, José, for this very clear and insightful analysis and your thoughts about trust and expertise in a digital society. In my, of course, short comment, I want to take up especially your thoughts on the role of a common ground, the context collapse of online content, and the conditions of consensus. I want to do this with two theses. First, trust is a question of primary orientation towards the true and the good. if I understood you correctly, Josie, you stated that ultimately a common ground is a necessary prerequisite for trust in science, and you described a common ground as a gathering of facts and insight that was carefully established and that therefore got accepted by a community. Thus, trust is less anchored in a specific scientific approach or finding itself, but rather in science as a societal institution that has to live up to integrity, transparency, independency, and accountability. In the digital age now, everything online appears as content with only little evidence on important contextual features like who says what, in which context, and based on what authority or expertise, the so-called context collapse. Thus, online content is undermining the institutional aspects of science. According to this approach, it seems not to be primarily important for trust whether there is a scientific consensus or not about some facts or insights. It is rather decisive that the process of practicing science is based on sound rules. Thus, consensus is conceptualized as a result of a scientific process, not always immediately achievable, but once, when achieved, it is a legitimate starting point for far-reaching policies shaping societal life. Starting from there, I want to claim that consensus undoubtedly plays an important role with regard to facts and insights, but even more in a value-related respect. Let's call the specific value at stake orientation towards the true and the good. In the online world, where, as is often deplored, one opinion counts as much as the other and scientific findings are not more than opinions from another kind, context collapse opens up the room for arbitrary interests, preferences, and manipulating forces, profiling, Cambridge Analytica, and so on. Regrettably, modern democracy and the prevailing human rights approach of ethics, which is prevailing at least in the public sphere and in policies in the Western world, support this kind of arbitrariness in a subtle way. The main message is, everyone has a lot of rights and only a few duties. Apart from some claims, mainly grounded in freedom, autonomy, and justice, everyone can choose his and her own values and lifestyles. There is no truth out there telling us how to live a good and meaningful life as individual or as society. So why not going for what is most appealing individually instead of looking for the common good? This pertains also to societal institutions. Even if someone knows the scientific context, appreciates the approach of sciences, and believes in the authority of science as institution, why behaving according to scientific insights and supporting policies grounding in them? Truth only pays off if orientation towards the true and the good is a shared value, not only for scientists, but also for societies. Trustworthiness as a feature of persons and institutions is grounded in attitudes, especially in the orientation towards the true and the good. Where the true and the good do not play a major role anymore, trust shifts from expertise to the arbitrary and from the right to the comfortable. This approach has a further consequence. If orientation towards the true and the good is a necessary prerequisite for trust in expertise and trustworthiness of scientists, then societies play a role in defining and finding the true and the good. Demanding this kind of orientation from scientists and societies entails that it is not the societies graciously receiving the truth from science and the good from ethics or some authorities, only having the challenge to understand it and to kindly recognize and acknowledge the authorities, but
societies are the context and living environment of science, thus being part of the dialogue about what is true and good for whom, based on what reasons, and taking into account different forms of expertise. I come shortly to my second thesis, and that is trust is a question of the human image. This fits perfectly, I think, with what Antonio Lopiero referred to as contextualization and the frames of references. In your talk, José, you mentioned that in some scholarly disciplines, and amongst them ethics, consensus on specific topics is unlikely ever to emerge. I completely agree, but especially for the public debate, it is important to stress that the consequence of this is not that ethics is arbitrary. As an ethicist, you have to argue in a methodological sound way. But according to the chosen method, you get different results, as in other disciplines as well, by the way. Arguing about the permissibility to kill a handicapped newborn, a utilitarian approach will come to another conclusion than a theory starting from human dignity. Scrutinizing the decisive differences between the various ethical theories, one ends up in two fundamental differences, at least to my mind. First, differences pertaining to the understanding of what is most important in a human action. For instance, it leads to different ways of assessing and to different yardsticks if a theory focuses on the consequences of an action, as utilitarianism does, on the underlying will, as in deontology, or on the acting person and her attitudes and inclinations, like virtue ethics. Second, on another and even deeper level of underlying concepts, this points to different images of human beings. If you see man primarily as a being that strives to unfold and flourish, or if you see man as being who leads an autonomous life on his own and strives for perfection, or if you see man as vulnerable being living in social relationships, this makes a difference for conceptualizing human actions and for shaping societal institutions. This is of outstanding relevance in times where the relationship of the human being to himself, to other beings, to nature, and to transcendental beings or entities is transforming dramatically what is at stake at the moment. This is due to the digitization of every aspect of our material and immaterial life. Luciano Floridi framed it that we are living an on-life in an infosphere, and that makes everything quite different. So to conclude, I'm personally convinced that society will only trust science and that science will only come into close interaction with society if for both, firstly, the orientation towards the true and the good is a primary concern, and if, secondly, the prevailing ideas of the human being become an explicit issue of debate. Thank you very much for your attention.
Excuse me, can you hear me? Is that okay? Well, it's up to me to sort of give another lecture, 2 hours, responding to each of these comments, which I won't do. Well, no, we only have 50 more minutes, and we also have a question. Very, very briefly, I cannot thank you for your comments. I think they really, very elicit a lot of thoughts, which I won't go into, but answer one of your questions, which I thought was really interesting. You say that a lot of researchers have to work with new tools, which is true. I mean, they cannot solve the problem of scientific disinformation by inventing new tools, but they can also not afford not to use, digital tools that they're attacked with. So it's not a matter of either or, it is both and. And that's why I think that an interesting notion of hybridization comes up. where, you know, you cannot stand outside of these developments and judge them with merely, you know, standards that you brought with you from a past. You have to develop standards and measurements and tools alongside with these digital developments. So you cannot afford to stand apart from the whole field of, well, for instance, you know, humanities scholars developing tools to actually do the research that they can no longer do in otherwise they would no longer be able to do their research in the digital age. So, you know, it's not an either-or question, it's a both-and question. That's one comment I would like to give here. Christiane, thank you once again. Those were very thoughtful comments. If I had like a chapter to write, you know, I would certainly include them. I have to stick to 20 minutes now. But one of the interesting things you were saying is that on common ground and consensus, you know, the context from which I was arguing about common sense, common ground, and consensus was not that that is for scientists or for researchers to have that as their ultimate goal. On the contrary, I was asking this question in the context, you know, where polarization and a lot of disinformation has come into the equation, and you have to somehow deal with that. Now, I did not argue for consensus as an ambition, a scientific ambition. And you said that very well. Consensus is a value at stake, and I completely agree. This is a value that should be part of our, you know, our reasoning and our reasonable discussions with, you know, both experts and non-experts. So I very much like that phrase. You know, consensus is very much the value that's at stake. The opposite is, and that's the context I was trying to outline, vis-a-vis consensus, we have opinion as, you know, just opinion. And if you start with opinion as the most important value, as opposed to consensus as a value that's at stake, you know, this is going to be a very, very different discussion. So I was trying to put the spotlight on what happens if you are like the daughter of my friend, if you're moving around in a world where it's no longer easy to distinguish between opinion and fact, because you no longer get the context, in a context of learning you to distinguish between what is what on the basis of a certain publishing context that all of you, I mean, everyone over 50 has sort of learned, you know, from in their backgrounds. Now, on the other hand, I'm not arguing, you know, one example is actually my daughter's friend who is 16 years old and who is extremely, you know, very well skilled in finding information on the internet with the right guidance and the right balance and the right mentoring. She is perfectly able to tell the difference between, you know, different sources. And that is what I think we need to engage with, is these kind of new processes that these young, you know, students, young children are actually confronted with. You know, as a 16-year-old, I was probably not able to go to a library and find the right source exactly, you know, in the right context and do all that sort of expertise stuff that I'm able to do now. But certainly these children, you know, for them, there's another dimension added to that type of learning behavior that they need to, you know, another dimension that they need to learn now. And that is something we cannot, you know, we have to engage with. We simply cannot afford not to. And that's why it is such an important value. You know, also teach them the idea that, hey, you know, there's not just opinion, there's, you know, different values in opinions and facts. And so that's the kind of engagement I was looking for.
I perfectly agree. I just frame it perhaps a little bit different in the orientation towards the true and the good. So at some point, societies have to rely on that scientists do that, and science has to rely on that the publics do that. Yeah, because if we don't agree on that, then everything becomes opinion and preferences and individual stakes.
Actually, yeah, that brings me to the second part of your question, which I think is a very valid point. You know, societies as such have to deal with digital disruption of everything, not just science. We have to see that in the context of the disruption of labor, of digitization of not just our media context, but you know, transport for that matter, or education itself, you know. So there's all these different sectors that we need to look into, because digitization, for one thing, is not simply an issue we need to deal with within academia, within science, or within media. It is part of our, the entire societal transformation that we're going through, which I said at the beginning of my talk.
So we now have the possibility and the time for questions, remarks. Who wants to start? Yeah, Günther.
Jose, I totally agree with your 4 principles for what science and scientists should really do. What I did not catch really, how you entered the field of open science. Was this a solution or was this a problem? Because I don't see the solution of open science, because you can collect birds and you can collect in this kind of public science and nevertheless not believe in vaccination. How did you bridge that?
Yeah.
I missed that point.
Yeah, you're probably right, because I skipped pretty much, 50% of the paper. So that was mostly in the paper. So you're right to catch that. That was sort of the transfer to the second part of my argument. Open science is not a solution to, any of these problems. I said it in the context of, it's an obligation. Once you're in a digitized society, if all of us as public scholars, we need to make public knowledge in public and open institutions. But I said that in the context of attacks on that openness, and the risk of putting everything out in the open is to get more, more scientific disinformation, basically, because then everyone can sort of, attack everything from all sides. So at the same time, it's not a solution to anything. It's almost like it's an inevitable requirement. We were already, putting a lot of effort into making science public and open, but the digital tools that we're using are requiring an extra effort to put into that, because now we not only have to, get familiar with the data that you put into this, but also with the scientific process of, reasoning, collecting. As Milana was just pointing out, it's not just collections that you put in there that make collections to be open. There's also prerequisites, preconditions that are there before you can put a collection into a scientific environment. So you have to make everything up to the process, in the process of making things open, you have to make that open too. And so that's a double effort that we need to talk about when we talk about open science. So it's not a solution, it requires a double effort to put into that, making everything open. Is that an answer to your question? This is the short version.
It answered my question, but I'm not content. I don't see the full obligation of taking part in this movement, which could be a trend and which goes away again. I understand the value of digitization, everything I understand, but the question if I have to be permanently online is something which I would not easily accept.
Okay, but being permanently online is not what open science is all about, so we have to make sure that we're talking about the same thing. Well, by open science, I simply mean that a lot of the new sources of knowledge are going to be digital only. And a lot of these sources are not, are not sources that we're digitizing, but that have, they're digital from the very beginning. To make them open, rather than closed in a private or company or, whatever corporate environment is a huge difference. A lot of algorithms that we're now using to process knowledge are not open knowledge. They're not, they cannot be openly accessed. They're closed in the sense of they're being privatized. So part of our mission as public scholars is, of course, to, that's what I call by keeping academic knowledge open as a form of public good, is to make all that knowledge accessible. And by that knowledge, I mean knowledge that was digitized from the beginning, that was actually digitally born. Is that part of your...
Okay. Other remarks, questions? Yeah, Ali.
My question is about the contribution of the academic community to the present problems of communication with the public. And two particular aspects I have in mind are, first, assuming a position of technocracy and authority, and the other one is a certain brand of postmodern philosophical attitudes coming from the academia, actually arguing for epistemic and ethical relativism, certain way, at least that's how it's perceived by the public. And those are now a few decades back, but I'm wondering your take on how much effect has that had on the present problems of communication?
Oh, very interesting question that I have not done any research, any research for. So I'm just guessing, top of my head. Actually, perhaps you're more resourceful in this because you have studied more, ethical kind of questions, and this pretty much relates to that. Would you like to start?
I think it's not really possible to answer this question in depth, but I think there are already two different approaches in communicating. How should science or researchers communicate to the public? And I think a lot of people, of course not those here in this room, only those outside, think that communicating means to convey facts, to convey insights, to convey methods, to convey the institutional framework, and so on. And it is hardly really the major paradigm of scientific communication to come into dialogue. Yeah? Not to say something, but to listen. Yeah? And I think this is the first thing that science should do at the moment, begin to listen to the outer scientific, the world outside science. And there are some institutional frameworks for that, but sometimes there are a fig leaf, and so this can develop further. And I think that's very, very interesting because this goes into what was already said today, into framing the research question, into further developing methods of research, into interpreting the results, into implementing them into societal life, but not as scientists, and the society has to do that, but as a shared and a common endeavor, to say we want to do, and not at least, science is not being before implementing the results into society, but science is more and more dependent on the data that come out of societal life itself. So it becomes more a parallel or a shared, a joint effort. And this has to feed into the institutional framework that José referred to as well. So perhaps that's a start of an answer.
I'm glad you brought this up, and perhaps here's an example to sort of visualize that. All of you are familiar with Wikipedia as a tool, and we usually refer, even to students, we refer to Wikipedia as that's the source where you can find something. I never do that. I refer to Wikipedia as that's an interesting tool. Look behind the first screen. And what you see behind that first screen, in fact, at the back end of this tool, is you see discussion. That's exactly what you were talking about. You see discussion about how this knowledge came along, how it was in fact built, how it was changed. You can see the sources of who changed what, and from what resource. So basically, I do not refer to Wikipedia as a source, which often students do, which is very funny. They see, hey, I have this from Wikipedia. But I try to teach things like go behind, look, not just as a tool, but it's something that is brought to you in a specific way. So learn to gauge, to attribute knowledge to that kind of tool. And that makes you aware of how many of these communication tools have indeed brought us in a new type of scientific communication about science.
Okay, thank you. Other questions, remarks? Maria.
Well, thanks a lot for a wonderful talk and wonderful comments on the talk. I fully agree with you, Jose, the emphasis on education. And yes, it's primary, it's high school, it's students, but I also think general education of the public to help people understand how the scientific process works, how we deal with uncertainty, how we deal with conflicting findings, and how we attempt to reach consensus and sometimes have to say, well, yes, 10 years ago we believed that, but now empirical data show that. But one point that, and I know you only had 20 minutes, but I think we also have to look at the universities. We're here as ALLEA, we're here as the Federation of Academies, but we also have to critically reflect on the incentives that we have created in the university system, where it's get those facts out, where we have developed media, public relations at our universities, and we all know that the PR people try to go beyond the facts, and we all know that many scientists are vain, and they allow themselves to be seduced into saying things that they shouldn't do, or they beat on their breasts, yes, in 5 years I will have cured cancer. And I think we also have to be critical of each other, and be critical of those who are vain, and be critical of those who go beyond what their data say. That's just a point I wanted to make. I see that you're nodding, so I don't even have a question, but I just wanted to point to the role of the incentives that we as academia have created.
You make a very valid point, and this is something, of course, that we need to communicate constantly to scholars. On the other hand, I'm in the position as a media scholar. I also talk to journalists, and it's interesting to talk to them from this perspective of, from a professional point of view, journalists are very eager to sort of, buy into a lot of these things that the system is feeding them, right? The digital system that really prefers one-liners over careful, nuanced, scientific, logical reasoning, for instance. So I keep telling them, like, okay, you can do that in different ways, and use the internet, use your digital resources to actually, not just articulate one-liners, but to go into depth, to refer to sources. And there's certainly, a lot of media sources that also do that. And I think you refer to the universities, which is very, it's very, actually very legitimate to do that. A lot of universities have their websites, and they're not using them sometimes as a resource, but just to, refer to the next best article in Nature, or even more, in a lot of just newspapers. They could use their websites and their referrals and their resources to elaborate on that sort of nuanced reasoning, the nitty-gritty stuff, the methodological issues that are behind such texts. But they often do not do that because it's not flashy, it's not something that is sexy, that buys you more grants. So we have to do some soul searching, not just from, in our own professions, but also from the professional point of view, from journalists. I try to make the same point there. And we have to do that together. We cannot do that, either profession by itself. We're all in this digital transformation together. So we also need to look for, as you indeed called it, different attitudes. It's all about, learning different attitudes to deal with a new environment where other values and norms creep into the way that we communicate. Yes, it does require a lot more thought and a lot more reflection than I could put into these 20 minutes, and we're really at the beginning of, what I was pointing at, that science paper in my presentation that came out last month, and that's really one of the first papers that talk really, substantially and with empirical evidence from that whole notion of confirmation bias, for instance. It's just stuff that we are just beginning to realize, and that we haven't really fully, fleshed out yet in our research to come to very substantial conclusions about how this process works and what we need to do. So yeah, we're like, you know, entering a very fascinating stage of research, I think, to deal with all this stuff.
Yeah, Christiane?
I think this is such an important point about the incentives, but according to incentives, there are people who let them incentivize. So that's a relationship. We have to think about that as well, and I just want to quote, or to cite two quotations. One comes from the monetary sector, but I think it applies to the academic sector as well. As soon as a measure becomes a goal, it's no longer a measure. It's no longer adequate to be a measure. I think we have to be aware when measures become a goal. And the other one is coming from Barry Schwartz, a psychologist from the US. And he says, we talked about that with Carlos Moedas already, but it's really my favorite quote, that how we think about the course of planets does not change the course of planets. But how we think about human nature or societal institutions does change human nature and societal institutions. And this is another kind of responsibility, and I think that perfectly fits to what you said, Bill.
Thank you. I think with this quote, we come to the end of our symposium, and I want to thank all the speakers of today, the discussants, especially the discussants from the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, because you were asked when we already had the concept. So we could invite people from other countries and other academies, but we want to have you because you are the host, and it's fantastic what we are experiencing here. But you were confronted with our questions and were put into it. So thank you very much. The keynotes of today were covering the general problems and the big questions where our working group and our workshops stand for. So it's work in progress, and we have learned today how many questions, how many specific situations, how much context we need to go on. I want to refer to the third workshop in August 31 in Amsterdam, and it will be the workshop of Jose about the changing landscape of communication. That's to say, we go on with this team on this sector. The discussion papers will be published from the two workshops, and then we will go to the final events, maybe in Berlin, and go to the final publications of everything. But we are all aware that we are on a spur of real questions, and we don't have the answer of everything. But we make step by step, and I thought the answer of Susan this morning about what are we going to do in this situation, and she said, well, go on and try again, try again, try again. And so we will have to find our way, I suppose, but now we have come to the end of a long afternoon. Thank you very much for everything, for attending, for speaking, for commenting. I suppose there are some drinks, and at 6:30 we come together again for the Madame de Stael prize. 6:30 is okay, no? Yes, okay. Thank you very much.